In today's episode, we'll break down two important stories. First, we'll talk about the UAE leaving OPEC, and then we'll talk about no money, more problems for the music business. Welcome back to the Daily Brief by Zerodha, where we cut through the noise to help you understand what's actually happening in the most important stories from business and markets. I'm your host Akshara, and today is Thursday, 30th April. Coming to the first story. So on April 28th, leaders of the Gulf Cooperation Council met in Jeddah. They were there for an emergency session on how they would handle the Iran war. But there was one empty chair. A prominent Gulf country was missing from the proceedings. Sheikh Mohammed bin Zayed Al Nahyan, the president of the United Arab Emirates, was not in the room. In fact, UAE officials were decrying the GCC as being weak. Now, this was odd. The UAE had been cooperative until just a few weeks ago, and as recently as April 5th, the UAE was still sitting in OPEC meetings, adjusting its production for the sake of market stability. 2 days later, the OPEC publicly listed the UAE among countries that submitted updated compensation plans for past overproduction. But that cooperation began crumbling over the month. It culminated on the evening of the 28th when the UAE released its official statement. Starting from May 1st, it was leaving OPEC. So OPEC was founded in Baghdad in 1960 by 5 governments: Iran, Iraq, Kuwait, Saudi Arabia, and Venezuela. Its original purpose was less about prices than about sovereignty. Most of the oil from these countries was being pumped, priced, and sold by Western international oil companies, the so-called Seven Sisters. OPEC was the producer state's attempt to take that control back. 7 years later, well before there was a country called the United Arab Emirates, one of its 7 emirates, Abu Dhabi, joined the grouping. Now, for its first half-century, OPEC was largely a political institution. Its members coordinated on oil production and tried to shore up their bargaining power, but the machinery of their coordination was loose. National governments retained control over the output, and the body set production quotas for each country, but they were difficult to enforce and compliance was often uneven. But that changed in 2016. Faced with the explosive growth of US shale, OPEC signed the Declaration of Cooperation with 10 non-member producers, most importantly Russia. And this expanded group, OPEC Plus, set up a formal structure to manage much of the world's oil supply. That's when it became technocratic. So the 2016 declaration created a ministerial monitoring committee that would police its member states. Each OPEC member was assigned a baseline, a reference production level that the country operated at. And they were then asked to cut their production for amounts calculated as percentages of this baseline. Smaller subgroups could then layer additional cuts on top, and each country's production would be monitored, and members who overproduce would have to submit compensation plans to make up for the excess. Deviations from the cartel's mandate, in short, were now punished. Now, all of this depended on where your baseline was set. If that baseline was too low, the body's requirements, production quotas, cutting requirements, and more could quickly become a straitjacket. Now, the UAE had historically been one of the stalwarts of the OPEC, throwing its weight behind Saudi leadership and pulling its weight in production cuts. But the new structure was beginning to pinch. So ever since Russia had joined in, UAE had been growing uncomfortable with the new Saudi-Russia leadership axis that had taken over the grouping. The arrangement reeked of favoritism, and Russia's baseline production level was artificially inflated to bring it nearly in parity with Saudi Arabia, even though its historical output had been much less. Russia also played loose with the grouping's limits, overproducing frequently with little consequence. On the other hand, when the UAE exceeded its production limits in 2020, it was publicly rebuked. The asymmetry rankled. So the country felt shortchanged. It claimed that it had been assigned an artificially low baseline of less than 3.2 million barrels a day based on what it had produced in October 2018. That number, it said, was outdated. It had since invested heavily in upstream capacity, and the limits on it now felt too restrictive. By April 2020, it was pushing out well more than 3.8 million barrels, and that, it felt, was the right benchmark. The quarrel broke out in public, with UAE blocking a proposal to extend pandemic-era production cuts until its grievances were heard, bringing the body to a halt. The standoff was only resolved once they negotiated their way to a higher quota of 3.5 million barrels a day. Now, this would slowly turn into a repeated pattern of conflict and compromise, but compromises alone couldn't solve the core problem. The fact was that the UAE was investing heavily in oil infrastructure and OPEC Plus limits simply didn't keep up. The country had poured roughly $150 billion in new capacity in the post COVID years. By May 2024, the Abu Dhabi National Oil Company had built an installed oil production capacity of 4.85 million barrels a day, with targets for 5 million barrels by 2027. Meanwhile, its OPEC Plus sanctioned production limit still sat at around 3.5 million barrels. The country was forced to sit on almost 1.4 million barrels a day of unused capacity, close to 40% of what it had built. Of all OPEC Plus members, no other country was forced to keep such a high share of its capacity shuttered as UAE, and that cost the country serious money. By one Baker Institute estimate, UAE was letting go of roughly $3 billion in revenue every month. If it left OPEC Plus, by 2028, it could earn somewhere between $50 billion and $70 billion in extra revenues a year, about a fifth of Abu Dhabi's 2022 GDP. But there was little the OPEC Plus could really do. It was caught in a political logjam. Now, to update national baselines, it would require a unanimous vote among OPEC Plus members. But several of its members, like Algeria or Nigeria, had actually lost production capacity over those years. If baselines were to be reset to reflect reality, they would actually lose their share. So it made more sense for them to simply veto any change. OPEC simply couldn't accommodate a member whose capacity was growing while everyone else's was shrinking. The UAE was effectively trapped in its outdated quota. Meanwhile, there was a deeper structural problem at play which threatened the very logic of a body like OPEC+. The energy world, in the words of authors Daniel Lacalle and Diego Parilla, was flattening. OPEC was built to create a sense of perceived scarcity for a world that thought it would run out of oil. It was this sense of scarcity that gave its members their power. But that world was dying. America's shale revolution had, in one swoop, multiplied how much oil we thought we could access, and it had moved North America from a net oil importer to a producer that could go toe-to-toe with Saudi Arabia. OPEC Plus, by restricting supply and holding prices high, was simply creating the conditions for American shale producers to capture the market share. Every barrel OPEC withheld from the market was a barrel American shale would sell instead. Now, the initial promise of the OPEC was that when individual countries restrained themselves from producing oil, they would all earn more profits per barrel. But after the shale revolution, they were now simply subsidizing their replacement. At the same time, the energy transition had well and truly taken off. One could quibble about when it would happen and how much residual demand there would be, but no matter how conservative you were, it was increasingly clear that a country's oil reserves wouldn't always find buyers. The UAE has some of the lowest oil production costs in the world, well below those of American producers. By letting this oil sit in the earth, it was simply letting others catch up. The twin flatteners, extraction technology, and the energy transition had effectively ensured their oil likely wouldn't appreciate in price even if it waited. All that waiting simply wasted the potential of its multi-billion-dollar investments. And for what? Just so that laggard OPEC Plus members' bleeding capacity could keep afloat? Maybe the OPEC Plus could survive the poor economics, but layered on top of this was a political problem. The UAE and Saudi Arabia no longer saw eye to eye. Just a decade ago, their two heads of state, Mohammed bin Salman and Mohammed bin Zayed, were close partners. They moved together on most regional questions. In 2015, they had entered the Yemen war together, fighting against the Houthis. In 2017, they co-led a blockade of Qatar. But that alignment has been breaking down. From Sudan to Yemen, the two sides had started clashing by proxy all across the area. The economic frictions between the two too were growing. Where Dubai had enjoyed a long run as the Gulf's undisputed commercial hub, Saudi Arabia's Project HQ mandate, which forces multinationals to base regional headquarters in Riyadh in order to win government contracts, seemed to eat into its turf. Late last year, the conflict began to escalate. The two countries had backed different sides in Yemen. The UAE backed the Southern Transitional Council, a separatist bloc, while Saudi backed its government in exile. Late last year, Saudi forces struck UAE-linked weapons shipments at the port of Mukalla, and it also began striking STC military bases. Relations between the two countries seemed increasingly strained. And then came the Iran war. The conflict knocked out roughly 7.9 million barrels a day of OPEC output, a supply shock larger than COVID, the 1970s crisis, and the 1991 Gulf War combined. The UAE's own production crashed by about 45% to roughly 1.89 million barrels a day. The UAE, hit by almost 2,000 attacks from Iran, pushed Saudi Arabia and Qatar for a joint Gulf military response. But they declined. Anwar Gargash, the Emirati president's diplomatic advisor, called the GCC's response the weakest in its history. But amidst the chaos, the crisis also created a window. In any other time, the UAE's exit from OPEC Plus would have bearish repercussions across global markets, bringing with it serious international pressure. But in a time like this, with the Strait of Hormuz half paralyzed and regional supply already shut in, there was nowhere for prices to go. Brent was stuck above $110 a barrel on a war premium, an announcement that would have crashed prices in normal times barely moved them. UAE had a clean way out of the OPEC Plus. This is, by all accounts, a disaster for the OPEC Plus. For one, it simply creates precedent. The OPEC Plus has seen other exits before, like that of Qatar in 2019 or Angola in 2024. But UAE, unlike those others, is a heavy hitter, making up 12% of OPEC's oil output. Never has a country with this much heft and production capacity headed for the exit. Unless the OPEC Plus can comprehensively punish UAE for its defection, the next time a country wants out, perhaps Iraq or Kazakhstan, both of whom have already expressed their unhappiness, they'll find enough political cover to do so. But its problem is more insidious. OPEC's power was never really about its total production. It was about spare capacity. Whether to stabilize world markets or to punish an errant member, the OPEC's strength lay in how it could flood the markets with excess oil on command. A lot of that capacity, however, came from the UAE. It was the only country other than Saudi Arabia that could push a lot of oil online. With this exit, Saudi Arabia must reprise that role all alone. And this makes UAE's exit an existential concern for the grouping. A lot depends on the grouping's response going ahead. It could try raising the costs of UAE's exit, it could launch a price war, it could try other tools, economic blockades, airspace restrictions, and the like. It may yet even make an example out of the UAE, buying a few years of time. But it can't outrun a simple fact. The body was made for a world where oil was scarce and future demand was guaranteed. Neither is guaranteed anymore. For all the sources mentioned in this video, don't forget to check out our newsletter. The link is in the description. Coming to the second story. With the exception of the US, India produces more music streams than any other country on earth. There are approximately 18 crore people who use a music streaming app in any given month, more than the entire population of most countries. And yet, the entire revenue pool that all of this volume generates is smaller than the recorded music industries of South Korea, the Netherlands, or Mexico. We rank 15th globally. That gap between what we listen to and what we pay for is not a measurement work. It's the entire shape of the Indian music business, and it explains an even stranger fact. In the last 18 months, 3 major streaming platforms in India have shut down. ByteDance's Resso left in early 2024 under government pressure on Chinese apps. Bharti Airtel pulled the plug on Wink Music in November 2024. Hungama wound down its consumer streaming service in April 2025. Yet, through this carnage, the labels whose music those platforms were carrying, Saregama, Tips Music, T-Series, and Sony Music India, kept growing revenue. Listeners are up and labels are getting richer, but platforms are just barely able to survive. So, how does that work? To answer that, you have to look at how money actually moves through this industry. Once you can see the value chain, almost everything else falls into place. We also spoke to Ruchai Shukla, who spent more than a decade in the industry. This is a distillation of all that we found ourselves and learned from him. So a common confusion is to treat Spotify, JioSaavn, and YouTube Music as the music industry. But they aren't. The actual music industry sits one layer above them. The labels and publishers who own the songs and license them out. When you stream a song on Spotify, Spotify isn't selling you something it owns. It's renting access to something Saregama, Sony Music, or T-Series owns and paying them a cut. Now, every commercially exploited song is actually two pieces of intellectual property stacked on top of each other. The first is the sound recording itself, also called the master. This is the specific finished audio file you hear when you press play. So, whoever paid for the recording session, the singer's fee, the studio time, and the mixing typically owns the master. Globally, that's a record label like Universal or Warner. But in India, where film music dominates everything, the picture is different. Film producers commission soundtracks as part of their movie budget, which means they own the master at the moment of creation and then sell it to a music label like Saregama or T Series. The second piece of IP is the composition itself, the underlying melody and lyrics, which are separate from any specific recording of them. If someone covers an old song or remixes it for a new film, they need permission from the composition owner, even if they don't touch the original recording. The composition is owned by the lyricist and the composer. Typically, they assign their rights either to a publisher or to a collective body of their respective country, and that body makes sure the publishers get a cut of their music. In India, that body is the Indian Performing Rights Society or IPRS. Now, globally, the master rights and the publishing rights are typically split into two separate businesses run by different companies. But in India, the label owns everything. That single quirk gives Indian listed labels economic ownership over their songs that even Universal and Warner don't have over their globally signed artists. A comparison between Saregama and Universal isn't apples to apples since Saregama owns more of each song. Now to the part that explains how the actual rupees flow. So most of the world, including India, runs on what's called the pro rata model, sometimes also called the market share payment system. When you stream a song on Spotify, the platform pools all the money it earned in your country in that month through subscriptions and ads. It keeps a cut for itself, roughly 30%, which goes towards server costs, app development, marketing, and hopefully profit. The remaining 70% goes into a pot that gets divided up among rights holders. Now, this division isn't based on a fixed per stream rate, but on stream share. For instance, if Saregama's songs are accounted for 5% of all Spotify streams in India that month, Saregama gets 5% of the distributable Indian pool. If the pool grows because more people pay subscriptions, every label's per stream realization goes up automatically. If the pool stays flat but stream volume keeps rising, per stream realization falls. Now in India, the deals between labels and platforms also come in two other shapes that are worth understanding. The first is the minimum guarantee or MG. Here, labels charge platforms a fixed annual fee upfront regardless of how many streams the platform's users actually generate. This shifts demand risk from the label to the platform. It's how Indian labels survived the first years of streaming when paid penetration was tiny. The second is plain revenue share, where the label simply takes a cut of whatever the platform actually earns. Most Indian streaming deals are some hybrid of an MG floor and a revenue share upside. But in 2023 and 24, several platforms, Gaana, Resso, Hungama, found themselves struggling financially. They tried to renegotiate their MGs down or eliminate them entirely as they shifted to subscription-only models. On its earnings calls, Saregama attributed soft FY24 licensing growth specifically to this shift. The platforms wanted to share their plan with the labels, but the labels refused. Some platforms then died. That is the structural skeleton of this industry. Now, globally, the recorded music business is doing better than it has in a generation. Recorded music revenue reached $31.7 billion in 2025, up over 6%. That's 11 straight years of growth. But India breaks the pattern. We have 18 crore streamers, but only approximately 1.4 crore paid subscribers. Paid penetration is around 8%, while globally it's closer to 40%. Apple Music charges 119 rupees a month, and Spotify Premium starts at 139 rupees a month for its light plan. These are mass-friendly prices that can only exist because Indian users would walk away otherwise. It's also why platforms keep dying in India. Someone who generates a few rupees a year in advertising revenue but consumes hundreds of streams that the label still has to be paid for is a big drag on platforms. That's why the industry consolidated to 4 to 5 real players. You have Spotify, the only standalone audio streaming business of scale, still loss-making in India after 7 years. Then there's JioSaavn, cross-subsidized by Reliance Jio's telecom business. YouTube Music, meanwhile, benefits from Google's video ads business. And then there are bundled telecom players around Apple Music and Amazon Music, which exist as adjuncts to other subscriptions. But on the other side, Indian labels enjoy a far more privileged position. T Series is the dominant force in Indian recorded music. It's a vertically integrated behemoth producing films and also owning the soundtracks at the moment they're created with no separate acquisition cost. It distributes those soundtracks on its own YouTube channel, and other labels have to win bidding wars for new film music, but T Series doesn't have to. That structural advantage is what every other label is now trying to replicate in some form, and the most interesting move came from Saregama. In December 2025, Saregama announced a Rs 325 crore investment in film director Sanjay Leela Bansali's production company. In return, Bansali Productions agreed to exclusively sell its future Hindi film music supply to Saregama at a pre-agreed formula price. For Saregama, that was a relief. No more bidding wars for the next Padmavat or Devdas style soundtrack. Saregama has been busy elsewhere too. In 2022, it terminated its global music licensing deal with Meta, Facebook, Instagram, Reels because Meta wouldn't accept Saregama's new pricing. This meant that you could not use any of the Saregama songs while making your Reels. The deal was eventually restructured and Saregama signed a parallel YouTube Shorts agreement in the meantime. Now, that episode was a showcase of the bargaining position of a music IP owner with a deep, highly beloved catalog. The platform has more substitutable songs than the label has substitutable platforms. But the songs that people actually want to use in their reels are not infinitely substitutable. The other listed Indian label is Tips Music, which is the inverse of Saregama in almost every way. Tips runs a pure play music IP business with about 34,000 songs in the catalog that are predominantly 1990s and 2000s Hindi film music. It has no hardware, no live events, and no film music production drag. Its EBITDA margin sits around 70% against Saregama's 30% at the consolidated level. In 2024, Tips signed a global distribution deal with Warner Music and a publishing tie-up with Sony Music for global markets. The strategy was to outsource everything that isn't owning songs and milk the catalog. In essence, the Indian music business is a rights business rather than a platform business. The rights owners capture roughly the same money per stream regardless of which platform the stream happens on. They don't particularly care if Wink dies and its users move to Apple Music. The platforms, meanwhile, are fighting for users who barely pay and competing on prices that barely cover their costs. Same industry, opposite economics. Now, the single biggest opportunity in Indian music, one that the whole industry is hoping for, is paid conversion. Right now, 8% of Indian streamers pay for a subscription. If it moves towards the global average of 40%, the size of the Indian recorded music industry could roughly quadruple over a decade. But to be fair, that's a fanciful projection. Another tailwind is the catalog revival flywheel. You've probably seen this unfold many times. An old film song from the 1960s just resurfaces on Instagram Reels today. That, of course, earns royalties again. And very interestingly, over 40% of India's top 50 most streamed songs in 2025 were released before 2020. Now, the risks are glaring and large. For one, India is likely to remain free first for longer than anyone expects. Free YouTube, telecom bundles, and the residual culture of piracy all act as anchors on subscription growth. The optimistic story for Indian music labels requires Indian consumers to start paying for music in a way they have not done so for a quarter of a century. That is a huge ask. The second risk is the cost of content acquisition. Saregama's management has disclosed that the price range of a typical 5-song Hindi film soundtrack rose from Rs 15 to 25 crore in 2024 to Rs 20 to 35 crore in 2025. If the labels are paying more for content than they can earn from it over its lifetime, the headline revenue growth turns out to be unprofitable. And this is exactly the risk that Saregama's deal with Bansali Productions is meant to manage. The third risk is, well, AI. Universal, Warner, and Sony Music have already sued generative music platforms Suno and Udio for training their models on copyrighted catalogs without licenses. Universal recently settled with Udio and announced a partnership to build a licensed AI music product instead. This might be the template the rest of the industry could follow. Now, India hasn't yet had its equivalent legal moment, but the questions are already showing up in viral form. One AI cover doing the rounds takes the title track of 2025 Sayara and regenerates it in Kishore Kumar's voice. Arguably, three things are being used here without permission. The composition, which belongs to whoever owns Sayara's publishing, the master, which the AI manufactured rather than copied, leaving its status unsettled, and Kishore Kumar's vocal identity itself, which has no clear legal home in India since he died in 1987. None of these have clean answers in current Indian law. There's music, there's business, and there's music business. Those three things only sound like they should overlap. And of course they do. But as activities, they couldn't be more different. Now coming to the tidbits. Japan's Mitsubishi UFJ Financial Group, or MUFG, is expanding its Indian operations, stepping into the real estate sector and offering forex derivatives. It's a strategic, albeit quiet move by the Japanese banking giant to capture a slice of India's property boom and meet growing corporate demand for financial hedging. Coming to the next tidbit. Indian MSME exporters are abandoning legacy banks and the SWIFT network in favor of high-speed fintech payment rails. By securing direct access to core payment networks, fintechs are offering exporters faster cash realization, transparent FX conversions, and fewer hidden fees, marking a quiet shift in B2B banking power. Coming to the final tidbit. European luxury brands usually guard their Made in Italy tags fiercely, but Prada is breaking the mold by explicitly marketing a new line of $881 woven leather sandals as Made in India. It's a subtle but massive signal that global luxury giants are beginning to view Indian craftsmanship as a premium label rather than just a back-end cost saver. That's all the news I have for you. Thank you so much for watching, and see you in the next one.
Disclaimer: this content is for informational purposes only. None of the stocks, brands, or products mentioned are recommendations or endorsements.